G'day everyone, or pointed out. So today, as you can see on the title, we are presenting about fat bikes. I'm Yazi, that's Pierre, Haley, Connor, and Nick. So upon arriving in Amsterdam, we were mesmerized by the organized complexity of cycling. And we heard, whilst we were here, a lot of negative rhetoric about fat bikes being a disruption to the established Dutch cycling norms and potentially a danger to society. So perhaps they are disruptive, but as outsiders, we couldn't make the determination inherently without understanding what it's like to be on one. Looking at the media, this is presented as a public health and safety crisis. In response, the discussion has evolved into that of control and discipline in the fat bike riders. So if we say fat bike riders are the core of the problem, then we're going to have to devise a research method to really challenge that idea. And so throughout the 3 weeks that we were here, we drew upon learnings and presentations by Ran Dang, Dr. Tina Harris, Dr. Jan Salazari, and Dr. Herman Mormon in the audience to question the norms and the subjective experiences of cycling. So our research question is, do the norms and subjective experience of cycling differ when riding on a fat bike versus riding on an Omnifeeds, and how? So in the frame of subjective experience, it might be that they feel differently and so they adapt to that different handling style, but there hasn't been any methodological approaches as such. And we chose to compare these two types of bicycling genres because the Omnifeeds is the quintessential bicycle in the Netherlands, and typically it has an upright riding position, self-propelled, whereas in contrast, the fat bike is characterized by obnoxiously large tires and is not self-propelled. And sometimes there are modifications to them that allow them to go very fast. Passing on to the next one.
So we conducted a pilot study to investigate the norms and subjective experiences and how they might differ between fat bike riders and Omnifeeds riders. Before explaining our approach, it's important to acknowledge our own positionality and how it might impact our interpretations of norms and subjective experiences of different kinds of cyclists here in the Netherlands. Firstly, none of us are Dutch. Within our group, we have 2 Americans, 2 Australians, and 1 French person. Each of us frequently cycles in relatively car-dependent contexts. We all see cycling as being very important to prioritize, but among us are transport planning researchers, practitioners, graduate students, and cycling advocates. We're all experienced cyclists, but we had very little experience riding fat bikes prior to this study. We view fat bikes as a bottom-up response to a problem we don't fully understand yet, and top-down regulatory solutions have begun to be discussed. So we learned in this course that ethnography helps to identify gaps between top-down planning and bottom-up uses of space. To paraphrase Dr. Tina Harris in her presentation in the course, to facilitate knowledge exchanges between opposing parties, have them switch places. To investigate this topic and broaden our understanding of how fat bikes fit into the Amsterdam cycling context, we became our own research subjects. To measure the subjective experience of cycling, we designed a small experiment. Each of us rode along a designated route on both an Omnifeeds and a fat bike, and then completed a survey immediately after each ride. The survey was informed by this framework of the subjective experience of cycling and included questions about each of the components highlighted here. And I'll have Connor explain a little bit more.
Alrighty, so Rand's work is about the plurality of experiences when cycling, but something that we found really interesting was the similarities between us on each of these modes. So for example, most of us mentioned feeling self-conscious or embarrassed when we were riding a fat bike. One of us mentioned that I felt really out of place with all the riders. And a few of us have actually attributed this to the fat bike stigma, making us feel like we were doing the wrong thing by being on one of these bikes, or that we had to conform to the negative behaviour norms that are associated with this method of transport. On the other hand, we had some more positive reported more positive emotions on the Oma feeds and said that we were able to blend in a bit more, with someone saying, I did have a feeling of not sticking out. We noted that on the Oma feeds, our sensory input came from our surrounds. One of us saying, I saw a lot of interesting shops and cafes. I heard some birds by the park. Others noted feeling the bumps in the road or the smell of garbage on the side of the road as well. Whereas on the fat bike, our sensory input was dulled and narrowed. Most of us mentioned that the only sounds that we heard was the rumbling of our own tyres, and that from a visual perspective, we looked only at the road and other road users. Interestingly though, despite these differences, our perceived safety was very similar on both bikes. Most of us acknowledged the different bikes required us to direct our attention to different things to remain safe, but overall we still felt really in control and that we maintained our normal methods of negotiation and communication with other road users. So overall, our subjective experience of riding the two bikes were different, but we suggest that perhaps elements of these gaps might narrow with a bit more experience on the bike.
Okay, so we then performed observation largely informed by the autoethnographic approach we have just presented. So what have we done? We have been on the field recording 40 minutes of videos at 3 different crossings in Amsterdam, featuring roughly 1,500 cycles, among which we identified a little more than 80 fat bikes. So what are the findings, the main findings? So first, only roughly 5% of people cycling are actually cycling on fat bikes. Also, cyclists in most cases obey the rules and follow similar norms regardless of whether they are on a fat bike or on a Mafit. And also, it's important to mention that during this time we have so no collisions of any sort, and we have only identified one fat bike riders that could have been identified as reckless.
So our pilot study had a limited observation set, and in future research, we really like to expand to a larger sample with more diverse locations in the city and in the suburbs. We also like to employ more advanced technology and better techniques to capture the full story of behavior. In other studies, a POV camera on a rider, plus maybe an aerial drone shot, really we think gives a great understanding of how people are negotiating, how norms are being observed. And we would like to also expand the subjective experience element by conducting a true ethnographic study rather than the auto-ethnographic study that we did in the pilot. We recommend a larger sample set consisting of people who identify as fat bike riders and people who identify as Omafeets riders. This expanded method would provide a much deeper and clearer picture of the differences and similarities of the subjective experience and riding behaviors between so-called self-identified fat bike and Omafeets riders. And this information would help to inform policy and refine the discussion around the emerging technology of fat bikes. So we're really encouraged that there's a lot of enthusiasm for road safety in the conversation, especially for young people. It's also great that the mainstream conversation is challenging where motorized vehicles should go and how fast they should go. However, we can't ignore the serious reality around deaths on the road. This table is a representation of media reported road deaths by vehicle crash type. This figure has some limitations, but the important thing to know, and it's really clear by looking at it, is that light vehicles like like bikes, and people interacting with each other have very little rates of fatality, while cars are orders of magnitude more deadly. So, in conclusion, if we really want to make safe, livable streets where young people are not injured and killed, I think we need to channel this energy towards the real problem and reframe this discussion. Thanks.